There is a stadium in Berlin that still exists. Its limestone columns rise 36 meters above the ground. Its stands can accommodate more than 70,000 people, and its walls were designed to speak of power before the referee blew the first whistle. In the summer of 1936, the world's best athletes ran on that track and jumped on that grass while the world applauded. But that same stadium, built by direct order of Adolf Hitler, also witnessed something that is sometimes forgotten in history books. Football matches. Starved to death on the fronts, players who traded the ball for the rifle and never returned, clubs that disappeared by a decree, a national team that lost to its own puppet states, and a regime that believed for 12 years that it could tame the most popular game on the planet. Football had been rooted in Germany for 2 decades, when Hitler assumed the chancellorship in January 1933. By then, the Deutsche Fußball-Bund had hundreds of thousands of members, and regional stadiums filled up every weekend. But the regime setting up in Berlin was not going to let that phenomenon take its own course. What came next was an unprecedented experiment, turning a sport into an instrument of doctrine, propaganda, and control. And as usually happens with experiments that mix politics with something people truly love, things did not go according to plan. The DFB before the Brown Storm, the Gleichschaltung of German football. On January 30th, 1933, the very day Hitler took the oath of office as Reichskanzler, the Deutsche Fußball-Bund was going through its own internal crisis. A crisis that had little to do with politics and a lot to do with money. Since the mid-1920s, the big German clubs had been pressing for the legalization of professional football. Eintracht Frankfurt, Bayern München, Spielvereinigung Fürth, VfB Stuttgart, Karlsruher FV, and VfR Mannheim threatened to leave the organization if the DFB continued to block the transition to paid amateurism, and the DFB had very concrete reasons to resist. If professionalism were admitted, the clubs would lose their non-profit status and with it their tax exemption. In Austria, they had already witnessed the disaster. Clubs like Rapid Wien allocated more than 73% of their income to tax payments, with money that was barely enough to cover salaries and current expenses. The conflict was resolved in a way that no one at the DFB would have anticipated. Hans von Tschama und Osten, the new Reichssportführer appointed by Hitler, intervened in the debate and sided with those who wanted to maintain amateurism. The reason was strategic and had little to do with sporting principles. In the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games, professionals could not compete, and Hitler needed medals. Felix Linnemann, president of the DFB since 1925, was designated in June 1933 as Provisional Commissioner of the Reichsfachschaft für Fußball, the new federal structure that the regime imposed on sports. On July 9, 1933, at the DFB Congress, Linnemann spoke with a clarity that left no room for ambiguity. We were previously an organization founded on the old law, built in a liberal way. Today we have the duty to abandon that path and adopt the leadership principle imposed by the state. He said it with conviction, and he was not a recent opportunist. The records of the Bundesarchiv in Berlin show that Linnemann did not join the NSDAP until 1937, but that did not prevent him from being the architect of the integration of German football into the apparatus of the Third Reich. Enthusiasm, in his case, preceded the membership card. That institutional transformation was given a name that in German sounds almost technical and administrative: Gleichschaltung. Coordination, forced unification of all social structures under the command of the party. And football was no exception. The architecture of German football changed radically between 1933 and 1934. The 7 Landesverbände that existed under the Weimar Republic, each with broad operational autonomy, were dissolved. In their place appeared 16 Gaue, 16 districts whose boundaries were drawn according to ethnographic criteria and which reported directly to Berlin. And within each Gau, a Gauliga would operate. a regional league whose champions would advance to a national phase to contest the title of champion of Germany. It was an archaic system, criticized by many German officials who looked toward the centralized national leagues of England or Italy and saw efficiency where the Reich saw danger. But the regime chose the Gauliga for a reason that was more political than sporting. Decentralization kept football fragmented, prevented the emergence of an autonomous economic power in the sport, and facilitated ideological surveillance over each of the 16 territories. That is how it started. A system, a structure, a control mechanism that seemed neutral on paper and was quite the opposite in practice. The DFB was formally dissolved in April 1940, turned into the Verband Fußball within the Nationalsozialistischer Reichsbund für Leibesübungen. Its assets passed into the hands of the state. Its archives, according to later researchers, were almost entirely destroyed or lost. The historian Dr. Niels Havemann, commissioned by the DFB itself to document that period in the monograph Fußball unterm Hakenkreuz, published in 2005, found a huge documentary void in the records of the Verband. What remained were minutes of congresses, press clippings, and the denazification testimonies that the officials themselves wrote after the war, always interested in presenting themselves as silent resistors. Georg Sandry was the General Secretary of the DFB and later Executive Director of the Verband Fußball during the entire period. In 1946, when presenting his denazification file in Neu-Isenburg, Hesse, he wrote that he joined the NSDAP for tactical reasons, to have a useful platform in negotiations with the regime. And he added something remarkable. He stated that within the Verband, he had managed to ensure that the infamous Arya paragraph, the Aryan paragraph that excluded people of Jewish descent from any organization, was not applied with the usual rigor, and that 50% non-Aryans had been able to participate in competitions. It was the kind of formulation used by someone who wanted to acknowledge the inevitable without assuming any moral responsibility. Sandry returned to his functions in the reconstituted DFB after the war. The continuity was almost perfect. The enemy within: Jews in German football. Before Hitler came to power, German Jews had built part of the foundations of football in their country. Walter Benjamin was born in 1873, the son of an upper-middle-class family from Berlin. At 14, he founded his first club in Montreux, Switzerland, where he was studying at a boarding school. At 16, back in Germany, he drove the creation of Karlsruher FV. It was he who proposed the name Deutscher Fußball-Bund at the founding meeting in Leipzig in 1900, when he was 27 years old. In 1920, he founded Kicker, the illustrated sports magazine that still exists today, and which Benjamin directed and edited as an expression of his liberal and cosmopolitan convictions. Gustav Rudolf Manning, also born in 1873 and also from a Jewish family, was co-founder of FC Freiburg in 1897 and participated in the Leipzig meeting the following year. Manning emigrated to the United States in 1905, practiced as a physician, and remained linked to football. In 1913, he was elected president of the United States Football Association and in 1948 the first to represent the United States on the FIFA Executive Committee. In 1950 in Rio de Janeiro, he was one of the voters who supported the readmission of the DFB into the world governing body a few weeks before the World Cup in Brazil. Two German Jews, in short, built the football of their country in its first decades and then helped to rehabilitate it after the catastrophe that this very country inflicted upon them. The rupture came abruptly. On January 30th, 1933, there were still active Jews in clubs, in federations, on board of directors. On April 10th of that same year, Julius Hirsch, 7 times international with the German national team and champion of Germany with Karlsruher FV, wrote a letter to his club communicating his intention to withdraw his membership. He had read in the newspaper that the main clubs of southern Germany had agreed to expel their Marxist and Jewish members. Hirsch did not wait to be notified of anything. He got ahead of it. In that letter, Hirsch recalled that he had been with KFV since 1902, more than 30 years. He mentioned his 2 national championships, his 4 regional titles, his participation in the Stockholm Olympic Games of 1912, where Gottfried Fuchs also played. Fuchs, with 6 international caps, had scored 10 goals in a single match against Russia in 1912, a record that no German player has matched to this day. Hirsch also recalled that one of his brothers had died in the First World War. Karlsruhe F5 responded by telling him to wait, that the official guidelines had not yet arrived, and that therefore his request to withdraw remained suspended. A few weeks later, the guidelines arrived. Hirsch had to leave. The mechanics of exclusion applied in German football in 1933 were described by historian Franz Josef Brüggemeier at the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung as a process of continuous marginalization. The DFB and the Deutsche Sportbund issued a joint statement affirming that members of the Jewish race were not appropriate for leadership positions in organizations and clubs. 2 national institutions with a single sentence delegated the responsibility for the expulsions to each individual club, and the clubs one by one complied. Some even got ahead of it, like Karlsruhe F5, which expelled its Jewish members before receiving any formal instruction. Gottfried Fuchs managed to emigrate in 1937. Martin Stock, another Jewish player who had been a member and popular referee at Altona Spielvereinigung in Hamburg, was deported in 1941 to the Minsk ghetto and survived, a statistical rarity that he himself would acknowledge after the war. Julius Hirsch did not have that luck. During the second half of the 1930s, he tried to work as a coach for Jüdischer Turnverein Karlsruhe 03, then for a French club in Alsace, and for a time as an accountant in a Jewish company. In 1938, that company was Aryanized, confiscated by the state and handed over to Aryan owners. Hirsch lost his job, fell into depression, and was briefly institutionalized. From 1941, he wore the yellow star sewn onto his clothes. An older turnstile watchman at Karlsruhe FV let him in through the stadium's back door so he could watch the matches. In March 1943, Julius Hirsch was deported to Auschwitz. There, his tracks disappear. In June of that same year, former Reichstrainer Otto Nerz expressed to the newspaper Berliner 12 Uhr Blatt his hope that, with the victorious march of the Third Reich, European sports would also be cleansed of Jews. Nerz had been the national team coach. He led Germany to 3rd place in the 1934 World Cup. In 1938, he still acknowledged his social democratic past in official documents. But in 1943, he wrote that. Jewish clubs met a different but equally terminal fate. Bar Kochba Berlin, which before 1933 competed at a level equivalent to the regional First Division, was excluded from all Gauligen from that very year. It could only participate in 3rd category tournaments organized for Jewish associations. In Frankfurt, the local Bar Kochba had 650 members affiliated with the Zionist movement. Sportverein Schild Frankfurt, founded in 1925 by Jewish veterans of the First World War, opened its doors in June 1933 to all Jewish athletes who had been expelled from their clubs. And the Jüdischer Turnverein, more religiously conservative, received Orthodox Jews who also no longer had a place in conventional German sports. KZ Theresienstadt, designed as a model camp to deceive international inspectors, had football leagues organized by the prisoners themselves. The Nazi guards allowed the matches because they were part of the facade. In 1944, when a delegation from the International Committee of the Red Cross visited the camp, the Nazis even organized a match under the name of Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism. The delegation left without reporting the real conditions. Behind that match were thousands of people who had already been or would be deported to Auschwitz. Decades later, in 2001, the name of Fritz Scheppan briefly shook German public opinion. Scheppan was one of the great players of Schalke 04 in the 1930s and 1940s, a club that won 6 national championships in that period and was, in terms of popularity, the most powerful football institution in Germany. When Schalke was going to inaugurate its new stadium and proposed naming one of the adjacent streets after Chopin, researchers knowledgeable about the club's history pointed out that Chopin had bought the textile business of its Jewish owner for a ridiculous price during the period of forced Aryanization. The official investigation confirmed the facts. The street did not bear his name. Walter Bensemann, the man who proposed the name of the DFB, who founded Kicker, who organized the first international match in the history of German football, died on November 12, 1934, in Montreux, Switzerland, the same place where 48 years earlier he had founded his first football club at 14 years old. He died in exile 79 kilometers from Geneva, where Kurt Landauer, president of Bayern München, would escape in 1939, literally at the last moment. The Bayern in the crosshairs, Bavarian identity under Nazi pressure. Bavaria was never easy to govern for Hitler. That does not mean it resisted. There was very little organized resistance anywhere, but the Bavarian identity, its regional culture, its deep Catholicism, its pride as an old independent political entity, created a constant friction with the uniformization attempts that the regime imposed from Berlin. National Socialism dissolved Bavaria as an autonomous political entity. It forced historic state enterprises to display the swastika on their logos. BMW, founded in Munich, had to redesign its public image. And FC Bayern München, the club that most represented that particular Bavarian and Jewish identity, became a specific target. The Bayern of 1932 was a powerful team. That year, it won the Gauliga Bayern, its regional league, and then was proclaimed champion of Germany for the first and only time in that period. Kurt Landauer, president of the club since 1913 with a brief interruption, was Jewish. The coach, Richard Dombey, was too. A significant portion of the members and the fan base had links to the Jewish community of Munich. The club was already known, with contempt, as the Juden Club. In 1933, all that collapsed. Landauer was forced to resign on March 22, 1933, just 7 weeks after the Nazi seizure of power. Dombey, the coach, was also expelled. Both left Germany, and without its directorial figures, without the support of its now harassed Jewish social base, without the protection of its regional identity that the regime was trying to erase, Bayern went from national champion to not being able to leave its own Gauliga. But the story of Landauer and Bayern has an episode that deserves to be paused upon. In May 1939, the entire Bayern team traveled to Geneva to play a friendly match against FC Servette. Landauer was living in that city at that time, exiled. The players went to visit him, to an exile, to visit a man whom the regime governing their country had stripped of everything. When the team returned to Germany, the Nazi regime reprimanded them severely for that gesture. This is documented by Niels Havermann. A football match in Geneva turned into a symbolic act of resistance. Shortly before, in November 1938, during the Reichspogromnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, Landauer was arrested and sent for 4 weeks to KZ Dachau, the concentration camp located 16 kilometers northwest of Munich. Dachau was the first camp of the Nazi system, opened on March 22, 1933, curiously the same day Landauer was forced to resign as president of Bayern. He left Dachau in December 1938 and emigrated to Switzerland a few months later. In 2013, FC Bayern inaugurated the statue of Kurt Landauer in front of the Allianz Arena. Landauer returned to Germany after the war in 1947 and was re-elected president of the club that same year. He died in Munich in 1961. The other problem for Bayern during the years of the Third Reich was structural. The regime did not want football to remain in the hands of an institution with so much independent weight, especially if that weight was accompanied by a Jewish and Bavarian history. The teams that triumphed in the national championship during that period came from other places. FC Schalke 04 from Gelsenkirchen dominated the era with 6 titles between 1934 and 1942. Dresdner SC won the last 2 in 1943 and 1944. Bayern was conspicuous by its absence from the podium. There was something else. German clubs were pressured to show the swastika on their uniforms. Bayern had to do it. An image that even today generates discomfort in the club's archives. That image, the Bavarian white and red with the swastika superimposed, is perhaps the most visual synthesis of what German sports were between 1933 and 1945, forced to wear an identity that was not their own. The Bayern in the crosshairs, Bavarian identity under Nazi pressure. Bavaria was never easy to govern for Hitler. That does not mean it resisted. There was very little organized resistance anywhere. But the Bavarian identity, its regional culture, its deep Catholicism, its pride as an old independent political entity, created a constant friction with the uniformization attempts that the regime imposed from Berlin. National Socialism dissolved Bavaria as an autonomous political entity. It forced historic state enterprises to display the swastika on their logos. BMW, founded in Munich, had to redesign its public image. And FC Bayern München, the club that most represented that particular Bavarian and Jewish identity, became a specific target. The Bayern of 1932 was a powerful team. That year it won the Gauliga Bayern, its regional league, and then was proclaimed champion of Germany for the first and only time in that period. Kurt Landauer, president of the club since 1913 with a brief interruption, was Jewish. The coach, Richard Dombey, was too. A significant portion of the members and the fan base had links to the Jewish community of Munich. The club was already known, with contempt, as the Juden Club. In 1933, all that collapsed. Landauer was forced to resign on March 22, 1933, just 7 weeks after the Nazi seizure of power. Dombey, the coach, was also expelled. Both left Germany, and without its directorial figures, without the support of its now harassed Jewish social base, without the protection of its regional identity that the regime was trying to erase, Bayern went from national champion to not being able to leave its own Gauliga. But the story of Landauer and Bayern has an episode that deserves to be paused upon. In May 1939, the entire Bayern team travelled to Geneva to play a friendly match against FC Servette. Landauer was living in that city at that time, exiled. The players went to visit him, to an exile, to visit a man whom the regime governing their country had stripped of everything. When the team returned to Germany, the Nazi regime reprimanded them severely for that gesture. This is documented by Niels Havermann. A football match in Geneva turned into a symbolic act of resistance. Shortly before, in November 1938, during the Reichspogromnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, Landauer was arrested and sent for 4 weeks to KZ Dachau, the concentration camp located 16 kilometers northwest of Munich. Dachau was the first camp of the Nazi system, opened on March 22, 1933. Curiously, the same day Landauer was forced to resign as president of Bayern. He left Dachau in December 1938 and emigrated to Switzerland a few months later. In 2013, FC Bayern inaugurated the statue of Kurt Landauer in front of the Allianz Arena. Landauer returned to Germany after the war in 1947 and was re-elected president of the club that same year. He died in Munich in 1961. The other problem for Bayern during the years of the Third Reich was structural. The regime did not want football to remain in the hands of an institution with so much independent weight, especially if that weight was accompanied by a Jewish and Bavarian history. The teams that triumphed in the national championship during that period came from other places. FC Schalke 04 from Gelsenkirchen dominated the era with 6 titles between 1934 and 1942. Dresdner SC won the last 2 in 1943 and 1944. Bayern was conspicuous by its absence from the podium. There was something else. German clubs were pressured to show the swastika on their uniforms. Bayern had to do it, an image that even today generates discomfort in the club's archives. That image, the Bavarian white and red with the swastika superimposed, is perhaps the most visual synthesis of what German sports were between 1933 and 1945, forced to wear an identity that was not their own. But the German championship, was not a story of absolute dominance by Schalke. There were interferences that the regime had not foreseen. In 1938, Hannoveraner SV took the title. In 1941, the champion was Rapid Vienna, an Austrian club that the 1938 Anschluss had forced to integrate into the German Gauliga. The final of that year, played on June 22, 1941 at the Olympic Stadium in Berlin before nearly 100,000 spectators, was supposed to be a confirmation of Schalke's hegemony. The Ruhr side managed to go 3-0 up after a few minutes of the second half. What happened next entered Central European football history. Franz Binder, a rapid forward nicknamed Bimbo, scored 3 goals in 10 minutes to overturn the scoreline to 3-4. Rapid was proclaimed champion of Germany. It was the same Binder who in 1938 had done the same in the Chammer Pokal final, with another hat-trick in 10 minutes to defeat Eintracht Frankfurt 3-1. An Austrian player in a Berlin stadium full of Nazi officials, executing the most incredible comeback of the era against the most powerful German team of the decade. Rapid became one of the few clubs in the world that has won the league championship in 2 different countries, and it did so in Nazi Germany. For 1943 and 1944, the dominance belonged to Dresdner SC. The Saxon club reached that stage with Helmut Schön as its great offensive figure, a forward born in Dresden on September 15, 1915, who between 1937 and 1941 was an international with the German national team on 16 occasions and scored 17 goals. Schön was the top scorer of the 1944 national championship, with 14 goals in the final phase, a figure that no one matched that year. Dresdner SC finished the 1942-43 season undefeated and was proclaimed champion for the first time in its history on June 27, 1943, by defeating FV Saarbrücken 3-0 in the final. The following year it repeated, defeating LSV Hamburg 4-0 in the final on June 18, 1944, at the same Olympic Stadium in Berlin. They were the last champions. The Victoria Trophy, delivered annually to the champion since 1903, disappeared during the final months of the war and was not recovered until after German reunification. Today it is exhibited at the Deutsches Fußballmuseum in Dortmund. Helmut Schön later coached West Germany for 14 years. He won the 1972 European Championship and the 1974 World Cup. The champion of the 1944 Nazi League, repurposed as the most successful national team coach in the history of post-war German football. Italy 1934 and France 1938, the World Cups of the Reich. The first international test of Nazi football arrived in Italy in June 1934. It was a peculiar moment. Hitler had assumed power just 16 months earlier, and on the domestic front the purges had already expelled Landauer from Bayern, Jewish players from their clubs, and officials who did not agree with the new order. But outwardly, the regime was still in the image-building phase. International matches were, according to historian Niels Havermann, tools of foreign policy. The Reichssportführer, the Auswärtige Amt, and the Ministry of Propaganda considered international sports encounters as a means to draw countries and regions that were valued politically, militarily, or geostrategically into the German sphere of influence. The German national team arrived in Italy with something to prove, and for a while it proved it. On May 27, 1934, Germany defeated Belgium 5-2 in Florence in its World Cup debut. The main goal scorer was Edmund Konin, who scored 4 of the 5 German goals. 4 days later in Milan, Germany eliminated Sweden 2-1 in the quarter-finals, with 2 goals from the same Konin. In the semi-finals, in Rome on June 3rd, the match against Czechoslovakia was more complicated. The Czechs were favourites, counting on players of the type of Oldřich Nejedlý, who finished as top scorer of the tournament with 5 goals, and they outperformed Germany 3-1. In the match for third place, on June 7th in Naples, Germany defeated Austria 3-2 and hung the bronze. The third place was presented by the regime as a sign of progress. There was some truth to that reading. The German national team of the years prior to 1933 had yielded mediocre results. In 1931, only 1 victory in 7 matches. In 1932, 3 victories and 3 defeats. The third place in Italy, 1934, was real. But 1938 was another story. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border. 2 days later, the Anschluss was official. Austria ceased to exist as an independent state. For Nazi football officials, that was an unprecedented opportunity. The Austrian national team, the famous Wunder team, managed by Hugo Meisel, had been for years one of the best in the world. Matthias Sindelar, the Austria-Wien centre-forward known as the Mozart of football, was the most admired player in Central Europe. If Germany could combine its best players with the best Austrians, the theoretical result was a practically unbeatable national team. The reality was different. Sindelar refused to integrate into the Reich's national team. On April 3, 1938, just 3 weeks after the Anschluss, Austria played its last match as an independent national team in Vienna against Hungary. Sindelar scored 2 goals. It is said that he scored them looking at the box where the Nazi leaders were, although this has been debated by historians. What is not debated is that Sindelar passed away on January 23, 1939 in circumstances not fully clarified, carbon monoxide poisoning, and that he never wore the jersey of the Großdeutschland, the national team of the Greater Reich. Without Sindelar, and with an amalgam of players who never managed to understand each other, the German-Austrian national team marched to the World Cup in France in June 1938. The first match, against Switzerland, finished 1-1. The rules of the time forced a replay match to be played instead of penalties. On June 9, 1938, in Paris, Switzerland won that replay 4-2. Germany was eliminated in the first round. For a propaganda machinery that had spent 5 years building the image of a reborn, powerful, and invincible nation, that elimination was an unexpected blow. The Reich absorbed it in official silence. Later, it organized a friendly revenge match against Switzerland in 1941, in times of war. The Swiss won again. The war on the football map, new federations in occupied territory, the invasion of Poland in September 1939 not only altered the political map of Europe, it altered the football map. The model that the regime applied in each occupied territory followed a recognizable pattern: dissolve the national federation, reorganize the leagues under German control, create sports structures that served propaganda and social control purposes. Poland was the most brutal case. The general government established by Hans Frank in October 1939 turned central Poland into a territory of direct German administration, where Polish football was banned or severely restricted. In cities like Krakow and Warsaw, clubs linked to the occupation administration and to specific military units emerged. Their matches were for German soldiers and settlers, not for the Polish population. The most historically analyzed case was that of Czechoslovakia, dismembered into 2 distinct entities after the Munich Agreement of September 1938 and the subsequent occupation of Prague in March 1939. Of the country that had reached the World Cup final in 1934 and the quarter-finals in 1938, 2 fragments remained: the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, under direct German control, and the Slovak Republic, a formally autonomous state but in practice dependent on the Third Reich. The Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia had a football national team that played exactly 3 friendly matches in its entire existence. Its best players lived under strict supervision. The Reichssportführer managed the schedules. Slovakia was different, with its own federation, its own uniform, its own anthem, and a sporting project that sought to demonstrate that the new state could compete at a European level, the Slovak national team organized its international debut for August 27, 1939, just 5 days before Germany invaded Poland. The opponent chosen for that historic debut was precisely the country that had made the existence of Slovakia possible: Germany. The match was played in Bratislava. 17,000 spectators filled the stadium and supported their national team with an intensity that surprised the German visitors. And Slovakia won 2-0. The Nazi regime, which had created that client state expecting it to function as a showcase of political efficiency under German tutelage, received a defeat at the hands of its own creation. And 5 days later, war broke out and the result became secondary. But the match remains in the records. Czechoslovakia had left Slovakia a generation of footballers capable of beating anyone. The tutor was humiliated by his pupil. The same happened in the Eastern Territories, the occupation of Yugoslavia, Greece, the Baltic countries, and finally the Soviet territories, generated in each case attempts to reorganize local sports under the German umbrella. Some were brief experiments, others had consequences that reached much further than the German organizers had anticipated. The front has a stadium football between military operations. There is something difficult to imagine in the image of soldiers playing football during breaks between combat. But that was exactly what occurred on multiple fronts from 1939 until the final months of the war. Football as a tool for cohesion and managing the mental state of the troops was not a Nazi invention. The British had practiced it during the First World War, including the famous Christmas match of 1914 in which Germans and British stopped shooting at each other in no man's land to play an improvised match. But the Third Reich systematized it with a specificity that no previous army had achieved. Wehrmacht divisions, SS units and support personnel organized friendly matches during rest periods between operations. Some divisions had their own stable teams with clear identification, differentiated uniforms, and records of results. Small tournaments were organized between units stationed in the same region. The declared objective was to raise morale, strengthen companionship, offer a psychological respite before returning to the front. But there was something more. Military teams did not only exist on the fronts, they also competed within the official system of domestic leagues. In the tables of the German championships of the war years, names appear that had not existed before 1939. LSV Hamburg, Luftwaffensportverein Hamburg, Air Force Sports Club Hamburg, MSV Brunn, Militärsportverein, Military Sports Club Brno, HSV Grossborn, Heeressportverein, Army Sports Club Grossborn. They were directly teams of soldiers integrated into the Gauliga, competing against civilian clubs with an obscene structural advantage. They could sign the best players from any club in the Reich simply by deploying them to their units. Civilian clubs experienced it as a permanent scandal. An active player with Schalke could appear in the following match day wearing the LSV Hamburg shirt if his unit required it. LSV Hamburg reached the final of the 1944 National Championship, where it was thrashed 4-0 by Dresdner SC, and that same year it also contested the final of the Chammer Pokal, losing 3-2 against First Vienna in extra time. A club that did not exist before the war, which was nourished by the best talents available by military decree, reached 2 national finals in the same year. Football in the occupied territories also left episodes that go beyond military matches between Germans. In Poland, the general government established by Hans Frank in October 1939 turned the center of the country into a territory administered directly by the Reich, where Polish football was banned or severely restricted. In Krakow and Warsaw, clubs linked to the German occupation administration appeared. Their stadiums, the very ones where Polish clubs had previously played, now served so that German soldiers and settlers could have entertainment. The Polish population was excluded as spectators, and certainly as participants. In Warsaw, the last match of the Polish national team before the German invasion had been played on August 27, 1939, a friendly against Hungary. Less than a week later, Germany crossed the border. The military teams that toured the occupied territories also served a function as a propaganda showcase. The most documented case in this sense was the Pariser Soldatenelf, the 11 of the Parisian soldiers, which operated in occupied France and attracted thousands of local spectators to matches organized as a spectacle. The presence of civilian fans at those matches was presented as proof of normalcy under the occupation, as if the war had interrupted nothing. Behind that image, there was a very specific political calculation. Mass sports served to diffuse social tensions in the controlled territories, to give the occupied population the illusion that the German regime was compatible with a recognizable daily life. On the Eastern Front, the mechanics were different. There were no stadiums, there were no regular kits. The football practiced in the eastern sectors was improvised, informal, sometimes literally contested on scorched earth between combats. German soldiers played on fields that hours before or hours later would be the setting for combat. That capacity to convert any flat terrain into a playing field said something about how deeply rooted the sport was, and also about the psychological need for normalcy that the combatants had. A football match was the most accessible way to pretend that ordinary life still existed somewhere. The most documented and most disturbing episode of this practice occurred in Kyiv, Ukraine, in the summer of 1942. Ukraine had been invaded in June 1941 within Operation Barbarossa. Kyiv fell in September of that year with one of the largest pocket battles in history. More than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in the following weeks. The city remained under the direct administration of the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, led by Erich Koch, whose occupation policy was one of the harshest of all the territories controlled by the Reich. Koch closed schools, universities, and Soviet organizations, established mandatory work for all citizens between 15 and 60 years old, and deported tens of thousands to Germany for forced labor. The Soviet League was suspended. Many players from Dynamo Kiev and Lokomotiv Kiev were mobilized into the Red Army or became prisoners. But a small group of former footballers remained free. The owner of State Bakery No. 3 on Degtярevskaya Street in Kiev recognized goalkeeper Mykola Trusevich begging in the streets and hired him as a sweeper. Then others arrived: Josef Kordik, Mikhail Putistin, Nikolai Korotkik, Ivan Kuzmenko, among others. 15 players in total, former high-level footballers working in a bakery while the city was administered by the Wehrmacht. The Reichskommissariat, Ukraine, had a policy they called pacification through normalization, creating an appearance of daily life that would reduce friction with the occupied population and facilitate the extraction of economic resources. In this framework, a local league was organized in Kyiv in July 1942 with military teams and one Ukrainian team. That is where FC Start was born. Between July 7th and August 9th, 1942, FC Start contested 8 matches. It won all 8. It defeated Ruk 7-2 in its debut, Ukrainian Sport by a margin of several goals, and then 3 Hungarian military teams and a club from the German artillery. The average of goals scored in that streak was higher than 6 per match. Men who played with empty stomachs, with boots that sometimes were not pairs, were winning against the army that occupied them, and that had consequences. The German authorities became nervous. On August 6, 1942, they organized a first match between FC Start and Flakelf, a team formed by pilots and elite personnel of the Luftwaffe that toured the occupied territories playing propaganda exhibition matches. FC Start won 5-1. On that afternoon, according to testimonies collected later, the Ukrainian players refused to perform the Nazi salute before the match and used instead the customary Soviet salute in sports competitions. 3 days later, on August 9, 1942, the rematch was organized at the Zenit Stadium, where Dynamo Kyiv had played as the home team. The referee was an SS officer. Before the match, that officer visited the FC Start locker room and informed them that they had to salute with an raised arm at the start. The Start players refused again. The match began with a predetermined score in the minds of the organizers, but not in the feet of the Ukrainians. Flakelf played with unpunished brutality. Goalkeeper Trusevich was deliberately knocked down while trying to stop a shot, and the SS referee allowed the goal to stand on the scoreboard. Despite everything, FC Start reached half-time winning 3-1 and ended up winning 5-3. In the following days, 4 FC Start players were arrested by the Gestapo at Bakery No. 3 on Degtyarevskaya Street. The charges were for espionage. Ivan Kuzmenko, Nikolai Korotkich, Alexei Klimenko, and goalkeeper Mykola Trusevich died in the Sirets concentration camp on the outskirts of Kiev. Korotkich was executed in February 1943. The other 3 died during the spring of that same year. The others survived. Soviet propaganda built the heroic myth. They had played knowing that winning was a death sentence. Subsequent historiography has nuanced that narrative. The players probably did not know that they were going to die if they won. But the difference between myth and reality does not diminish what occurred. The first newspaper to report the episode was the Soviet Izvestia on November 16, 1943, although without mentioning the match itself, only the execution of the athletes. The complete story took decades to be documented with rigor. Today, on the exterior of the stadium that bears the name of FC Start in Kiev, a plaque commemorates the names of the 4 executed players. The impossible final, the World Cup that never was, 1942. In 1936, the Nazi regime formally requested FIFA that the 1942 World Cup be held in Germany. The request made sense from the Nazi logic. If the Berlin Olympic Games had been an unprecedented propaganda spectacle, a World Cup on German soil would be even more useful. Stadiums were being built or expanded at great speed. The railway transport system was efficient, and the regime knew exactly how to convert a sporting event into an exercise in international legitimation. Hitler had understood from the beginning the propaganda value of mass sports. Historian Niels Havermann documents that the regime considered the Länderspiele, the international matches of the national team, as instruments of foreign policy long before the war broke out. The Auswärtige Amt, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda participated directly in the planning of international calendars. Every rival, every venue, every result had diplomatic implications that went beyond football. The war cancelled those plans. The 1942 World Cup was never held. The 1946 one was not either. The next World Cup was in Brazil in 1950, 12 years after the last edition in France. Only on 2 occasions in the entire history of the competition has the tournament been interrupted, and both were for the same reason. But between 1941 and 1942, there were matches that some historians and the press of the era called, with irony or admiration depending on the context, the unofficial 1942 World Cup. A series of friendly matches in which the German national team attempted to prove that it was the best on the continent. The regime had reasons to try. After the first-round elimination of the 1938 World Cup against Switzerland, the international image of German football needed urgent repair. And in 1941, convincing results had come. Thrashings against Bulgaria, Romania, and other rivals within the Nazi sphere of influence. The first chapter of the 1942 story was humiliating. On April 20th, 1942, the 53rd birthday of Adolf Hitler, the regime organized a celebration match, Germany against Switzerland, at the Olympic Stadium in Berlin. Switzerland had remained neutral since the first day of the war, and that neutrality included football. There was no political or diplomatic reason for the Swiss players to yield an inch. Germany lost 2-1. The result infuriated the Führer. According to various sources of the time collected by subsequent historians, Hitler threatened the footballers with sending them to the Eastern Front if they lost again. The threat took effect in the short term. In the following months, the German national team accumulated victories against rivals from the Nazi bloc or its orbit of influence: 5-3 against Hungary, 3-0 against Bulgaria, 7-0 against Romania. With that streak recovered, the regime organized what was presented in the German press as the grand final of European football, a friendly against Sweden on September 20th, 1942, at the Olympic Stadium in Berlin. The organizers sold it as the unofficial final of the 1942 World Cup, the match that would elucidate who was the best team on the continent. Sweden had reasons to be considered the best European national team of the moment. It had finished fourth in the 1938 World Cup in France, having been eliminated in the semi-finals, maintained the neutrality that allowed it to keep its best players active, and in its 1942 squad lived players who years later would be legends of the continent. Gunnar Nordahl, who would finish as the all-time top scorer for AC Milan with 221 goals in Serie A. Arne Neuberg from IFK Göteborg, one of the most feared forwards in Europe. Henry Karlsson and Malte Mortensen, the second also developed at IFK Göteborg, a club that in that era dominated Scandinavian football with authority. 98,000 spectators filled the Olympic Stadium in Berlin on September 20th, 1942. It was the largest sporting event of the year in Germany, designed to prove that the Reich was invincible in the sporting field as well. The threat hanging over the German players was known to them. Another defeat meant the Eastern Front. Arne Neuberg scored for Sweden in the 7th minute. Germany reversed the scoreline in the first half with 2 goals, one by midfielder Ernst Lehner, the other by forward August Klingler, the national team's goalscorer in those years. Klingler had been born in 1918 in Breisach, near the French border, and was one of the most promising players of the war generation. Germany reached halftime winning 2-1. In the second half, the script that the regime had imagined broke completely. Henry Karlsson equalized in the 57th. Malte Mortensen scored the definitive 3-2 for Sweden in the 75th. 98,000 people left the Olympic Stadium in Berlin defeated. The propaganda machinery that had promised a demonstration of supremacy received a defeat against a neutral nation that had no reason to concede anything. After that match, the German national team abandoned international fixtures. The official argument was that the war situation prevented it. The reality, documented by journalist Paul Brown and collected in various subsequent historical sources, is that the regime considered that new defeats would erode the morale of the home front at a time when the Eastern and North African fronts no longer yielded the victories that were expected. The last official match of the German national team in the Second World War was in November 1942 against the Slovak national team, one of the ironies of the period. The last time Germany played as a national team during the war was against a satellite state that 2 years earlier had already beaten them. August Klingler, the forward who had scored that goal against Sweden, the man whose career seemed destined to be one of the most brilliant in post-war German football, did not live to see it. He died in combat on the Eastern Front in 1944. He was 26 years old. The championship under the bombs, the 1944 final and the end of the era. While the Allies prepared the largest amphibious landing in the history of the war, Germany played the final of its football championship. On June 18, 1944, 12 days after D-Day on the beaches of Normandy, Dresdner Sport Club faced LSV Hamburg at the Olympic Stadium in Berlin. 31 Gauligan had crowned their respective champions and sent them to this direct elimination phase. Dresdner SC arrived as the defending champion of the title conquered in 1943, when it had also been the best team in the country. The Dresden squad included Helmut Schön, who was the top scorer of the final phase with 14 goals. LSV Hamburg, the military team of the Luftwaffe, had reached the final after eliminating rivals with whom it shared institutional advantage. It could absorb players from any club in the Reich for military service reasons, but that afternoon it was not enough. Dresdner SC thrashed 4-0. And the Victoria Trophy, the very same one presented to the German champion since 1903, was lifted for the last time in the history of the Nazi era. Several hundred kilometers away, on the coast of Normandy and in the fields of Brittany, German soldiers fought to contain an Allied advance that was already unstoppable. Operation Overlord had begun on June 6th, with the landing of 156,000 Allied soldiers on a front of 80 kilometers of coastline. The Eastern Front did not rest either. 3 days after the final, on June 21st, 1944, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration against Army Group Center. In a few weeks, the Soviets destroyed 28 German divisions, captured 300,000 prisoners, and advanced 600 kilometers to the west. It was the greatest defeat of the German army in the entire war, greater even than Stalingrad in terms of personnel lost. And in Berlin, 70,000 people had watched a football match. There is something in that image that resists any simple interpretation. Were those people indifferent to what was happening on the fronts? Or was it precisely because they knew what was happening that they went to the stadium, seeking for 90 minutes the illusion that life was still tolerable? Probably both things at once, in proportions that varied from person to person, from neighborhood to neighborhood, from family to family. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda had cultivated for years that capacity to coexist with news from the front without processing its real meaning. A combination of euphemisms, omissions, and cultural and sporting events designed to keep the citizen occupied with things other than casualty figures. The Gauliga continued to be contested during 1944 with a regularity that astounds anyone who studies it. Allied bombings on German cities had destroyed or damaged several stadiums, but calendars adapted. The Hamburg Stadium had been partially damaged in the devastating bombings of Operation Gomorrah in the summer of 1943, which destroyed 45% of the city and rendered many facilities useless. When a venue became unusable, another one was sought. When regular players were mobilized to the front, substitutes were sought among soldiers temporarily stationed in the cities or among youth who had not yet reached conscription age. The 1944-45 season even began ahead of schedule in November 1944, although in March 1945 the championship collapsed in most regions when the Allied armies crossed the borders of the Reich. The history of German football in the war years also has its starkest human face. Bayern München had 56 members mobilized during the conflict, not just professional players, members, employees, people from the club's environment who were counted as part of its community. 56 of them died in combat. Bayern itself, whose stadium in Munich had suffered damage from Allied bombings on the city during 1944 and 1945, played its final matches of the period on alternate or improvised fields. Borussia Dortmund also paid a particular price. In 1939, when the war broke out, 80% of the first-team players were active soldiers of the Sturmtruppen, the Reich's shock troops, and were mobilized immediately. The club practically disappeared from the competitive map for years. The clubs that had accumulated players of Jewish origin before 1933, and that had been forced to expel them, did not recover anything they had lost either. The ideological purge had permanently weakened their technical base, their economic structure, and their social fabric. Bayern was the most documented case, but there were dozens more across the length and breadth of the country. As 1944 advanced toward 1945, the situation became unsustainable. Teams lost players faster than they could replace them. Many clubs merged their squads with those of rival clubs out of pure necessity for sporting survival. Troop concentrations in cities and constant bombings made it impossible to maintain regular logistics for transport and security for spectators. The Victoria Trophy, presented to Dresdner SC in June 1944, disappeared in the chaos of the final months. It reappeared decades after German reunification, preserved in conditions that DFB historians have never been able to fully detail. The last match of the Nazi era on record was on April 22, 1945. Berlin was surrounded. Soviet troops had crossed the Oder on April 16th and were advancing toward the center of the city from multiple flanks. Fighting in the eastern suburbs was already audible from the heart of the capital. The Chancery bunker, where Hitler spent his final hours dictating his political testament and committing suicide 8 days later, was just a few kilometers away from where, that same April 22nd, Bayern München and TSV 1860 München played a friendly match. Bayern won 3-2. There were referees. There were players on the field. There were, according to sources of the time, some spectators. The sound of Soviet artillery was perceptible in Munich in those days through the radio and the rumors arriving with refugees from the east. And 2 Munich teams were playing a football match. It was the most persistent form of denial imaginable, sport as a shield against reality, sustained until the last possible instant. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. Germany signed the unconditional surrender on May 8th. All German clubs were dissolved by Directive No. 23 of the Allied Control Council during the denazification process. They were reconstituted shortly after, but under new regulations, without the records of the Nazi period in their official minutes, as if football could start from scratch. It could not, of course. History does not work that way. The return to football and unsettled accounts. The summer of 1945 in Germany smelled of rubble and burnt gasoline. Cities were geometries of ruins. Transport systems were broken. Public administration had disappeared. And the DFB, the organization that had managed German football for 45 years before being absorbed and liquidated by the Third Reich, did not legally exist. The Allied powers imposed restrictions on the activity of German organizations, including sporting ones. But the Germans began to play football before any authority formally authorized them to do so. On improvised fields, on lands that were previously parks or vacant lots free of rubble, with balls that were sometimes tied rags, matches began in the autumn of 1945. The new DFB was reconstituted in Stuttgart in 1949. The composition of its first board of directors deserves attention. Georg Sandry, the executive director of the Fachamt Fußball during the entire Nazi era, resumed his duties. Karl Kopperhell, the official chronicler of the DFB who had written about the Nazi period without mentioning any of its atrocities, also returned. Felix Linnemann, the president who had designed the Gleichschaltung of German football in 1933, had died, which spared the DFB from the need to explain his trajectory. Martin Stock, the Jewish player who had survived the Minsk ghetto, was on that first board of directors heading the competition committee. His presence was proof that some things had changed, but his exceptionality was also proof of the extent to which the continuity of personnel was the norm. Karl Kopperhell published in 1954 the Geschichte des deutschen Fußballsports, the official history of German football. About the years of National Socialism, he wrote that it had been necessary to navigate between the reefs without letting oneself be dragged into party political waters. An interpretation that historian Niels Havermann qualified 50 years later as a paradigmatic example of the young Federal Republic's resistance to confront the crimes of Nazism. It was not until 2001 when the DFB commissioned an independent scientific investigation into its role in the Nazi period. That investigation, directed by Niels Havermann, was published in 2005 under the title Fußball unterm Hakenkreuz. That same year, the DFB instituted the Julius Hirsch Prize in memory of the player deported and murdered in Auschwitz in 1943. The first winner was FC Bayern München, whose under-17 team had played that summer of 2005 against a mixed Israeli-Palestinian selection. Gottfried Fuchs, who escaped Germany in 1937 and finally settled in Canada, did not receive any invitation from the DFB for the Munich Olympic Games in 1972, despite the fact that national coach Sepp Herberger tried to convince the board of directors to invite him. The board refused. Fuchs lived until 1972. The record he had established in 1912, 10 goals in a single match with the national team, remains unequaled. There is a direct line between that 1912 record and the 10 years of the Julius Hirsch Prize, and what runs along that line is not just the history of football. It is the question of how long it takes an institution to recognize what it did and what it failed to do when it believed no one was watching. The historian Dr. Pascal Tries from the Institut für Zeitgeschichte München-Berlin is currently working on a project commissioned by the DFB Kulturstiftung to document in detail the role of DFB officials during and after the Nazi period. The work is ongoing. There are still questions without answers. What the ball could not conceal. In 12 years, the Third Reich attempted to convert football into something that football has never been anywhere or in any era, an unappealable political argument. It built leagues to control it, dissolved federations to appropriate it, expelled the Jews to purify it, created satellite national teams to showcase it, and organized finals under the bombs to pretend that defeat was not arriving. And football, with the indifference that real games have before systems of power, did not cooperate. The German national team lost in the first round of the 1938 World Cup against Switzerland. It was defeated 2-1 on Hitler's birthday by that same neutral rival. It lost against Sweden in September 1942 in front of nearly 100,000 spectators. It lost in August 1939 against Slovakia, a state that owed its existence to the Reich that had just been defeated, and in Kiev, in the summer of 1942, a group of hungry bakers won 2 consecutive matches against the team of the most powerful air force in the world. There were also players who died. August Klingler on the Eastern Front at 26 years old and with 6 international goals. The 56 members of Bayern München fallen in combat. The 4 FC Start players executed at the Sirets camp. Julius Hirsch, murdered in Auschwitz in March 1943 at 52 years old, after having served Germany in 2 Youth World Cups and 7 international caps with the senior national team. Football did not save anyone, but it did not fully bow down either. It kept putting the ball where it belonged, scoring the goals that belonged, winning the matches that belonged, without asking what flag was in the box. The stadiums built by the Third Reich remain standing in some cases. The Olympic Stadium in Berlin was host to matches of the 2006 World Cup. On that very same field where 98,000 people had witnessed Germany's defeat against Sweden in 1942, the German national team defeated Costa Rica 4-2 in the opening match of the World Cup it was hosting. 64 years of distance between the 2 matches. The same grass, another era, another country.